Every day, the royal guard stood tall, his uniform sharp, his demeanor composed, and his gaze focused ahead, watching over the grounds of Buckingham Palace. To anyone who looked at him, he appeared like just another soldier in the grand tradition of British history. His polished boots clicked on the stone as he marched in perfect unison with the other guards. From the outside, everything seemed perfect. But inside, there was a different story, one that he kept to himself, a story hidden in the shadows of his uniform. The royal guard had always been a man of few words. He had joined the army with a sense of pride and a belief that he could serve his country honorably. But like so many others, life had a way of taking unexpected turns. After years of service, he found himself without a place to call home. What began as temporary financial struggles spiraled into a bigger crisis. The guard had been living on the streets for months, making it through each day by relying on his resilience and resourcefulness. It wasn't that he hadn't tried to get help. He had. But there were always too many people needing help and too few resources. The shelters were full, and the government's assistance programs seemed to be designed more for those who could navigate the complex system, not someone like him, a man used to silent suffering. His pride kept him from asking for charity, so he stayed hidden in the shadows, outside of the world that never stopped for him. Most people didn't know. It was easy to keep up appearances when you worked in the royal household. The long shifts in the cold were exhausting, but they kept him distracted. He spent his days marching, standing guard, and following orders, all while silently trying to endure his struggles. He was a soldier, after all, and soldiers didn't show weakness. But the long hours had begun to wear him down. The lack of sleep, the cold nights, the hunger, it all began to take its toll. Some days, he found himself nodding off while standing still, only to snap awake at the sound of a distant voice or the clink of a nearby guard's boots. It was in these moments of exhaustion that he began to question his choices. He had dedicated his life to serving the royal family, but he had never imagined that the very people he worked for would be so far removed from the struggles of the common folk. How could they possibly understand the depths of despair he felt every time he went to bed hungry? How could anyone who lived in such luxury understand what it was like to sleep under the stars, to wonder if you would make it through the next night? Despite all of this, he never let his troubles show. He still stood proudly in his uniform, still followed his duties with the same precision as any other guard. But inside, a part of him had begun to break. There were nights when he found himself staring at the ground, wondering if this was all he would ever be. Just another face in the crowd, another soldier whose sacrifice went unnoticed. Yet he didn't want pity. Pity was something he couldn't stand. So he kept quiet, kept his head high, and kept going, even as the weight of his situation grew heavier. The royal guard continued his daily routines, not knowing that his silent suffering was about to be uncovered by the very man he served. One crisp morning, as the royal guard stood at his post outside Buckingham Palace, something unusual happened. King Charles, who often took walks around the palace grounds, was passing by on his usual route. As he walked, his eyes fell on the guard, and for the first time, he noticed something in his posture that seemed off. The guard's stance, although still straight and disciplined, had a certain weariness about it. His eyes, usually sharp and vigilant, looked tired, almost as if the weight of something was pressing down on him. It wasn't typical for a royal guard to show any signs of weakness, but there it was, a subtle hint that something wasn't quite right. King Charles, ever observant and curious about the well-being of those around him, decided to stop and engage in a casual conversation with the guard. He wasn't just the king to his subjects. He had always prided himself on being approachable, someone who valued connection over formality. So he walked up to the guard with a warm, friendly smile and said, "How is everything going, my friend? It's a bit chilly out here, isn't it?" The guard, caught off guard by the king's unexpected attention, snapped to attention. He had never been directly addressed by the king before, and certainly not during his lonely and tiring shift. For a brief moment, the guard wasn't sure how to respond. He hadn't been used to such kindness or casual conversation. But the king's approachable nature put him at ease, and he found himself replying with a simple, "Yes, Your Majesty." "It's a cold day indeed." King Charles noticed how the guard's words were quiet, almost distant, and there was a certain heaviness in his voice. He pressed on, hoping to learn more, sensing that there was something deeper beneath the surface. "I hope you're managing well with your duties. It's no small task to stand guard here, especially in such weather." The guard shifted his weight slightly, looking down for a moment as if gathering his thoughts. Then, without quite realizing it, he found himself speaking more openly than he ever had before. "It's not easy, sir, but it's what I signed up for." His words were measured, but there was an underlying exhaustion in his tone. He didn't realize that he had allowed a small crack in his otherwise solid exterior to show, but the king was quick to pick up on it. "What's weighing on you?" King Charles asked gently, his voice filled with genuine concern. He didn't want to pry, but the guard's discomfort was impossible to ignore. The king had always been perceptive, and it seemed clear to him that there was something troubling the man before him. For a long moment, the guard said nothing. His eyes scanned the courtyard, avoiding direct contact with the king. The silence hung in the air, thick and heavy, before the guard finally sighed, his breath visible in the cold morning air. I've been going through some difficult times, Your Majesty," he confessed quietly, almost in a whisper. King Charles, though taken aback, didn't push. He simply waited for the guard to continue, his expression softening in empathy. The royal guard, feeling the sincerity in the king's gaze, finally spoke the truth he had kept hidden for so long. "I've been struggling, sir. I'm homeless. I don't have a place to stay when my shift ends." The words hit the air like a thunderclap, startling both the guard and King Charles. The king's eyes widened in disbelief. How could it be that a man who served so loyally, who protected the royal family with his life, was living without a roof over his head? The revelation shocked him to his core, and for a moment he could hardly find words. The guard, unsure of how the king would react, stood in uneasy silence, bracing for judgment or dismissal. But instead, King Charles looked at him with kindness and compassion, his voice filled with genuine concern. "You should never have to face this alone," he said softly. King Charles stood there for a moment, processing the words the royal guard had just spoken. The idea that someone who served him so faithfully, someone who dedicated his life to protecting the royal family, was struggling in such a way was nearly impossible to comprehend. The king's heart sank as he thought about the vast difference between the luxury of his own life and the hardship the guard was enduring. It was a painful reminder of how much he, as a monarch, had become disconnected from the lives of the very people who worked for him. The guard, still standing at attention, was now looking at the ground, his posture stiff as he awaited the king's reaction. He felt a sense of shame and embarrassment wash over him. In truth, he never expected anyone to know about his struggles. As a soldier, he had been trained to endure, to be strong no matter what. Admitting he was homeless, that he had no place to sleep except the cold streets, was something he had never allowed himself to acknowledge openly, especially not to someone of the king's stature. King Charles, however, wasn't angry or disappointed. He wasn't going to berate the guard or make him feel small for what he had gone through. Instead, his face softened with concern, and his thoughts quickly turned to action. The king had always been one to act when he saw a problem, and this was no exception. He couldn't bear the thought of one of his own men suffering in silence. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" King Charles asked gently, his voice low but filled with genuine curiosity and concern. The guard looked up slightly, meeting the king's eyes. It's not something I'm proud of, Your Majesty. I didn't want to be a burden. I thought it was my responsibility to deal with it on my own." His words were heavy, like a weight he had been carrying for too long. King Charles nodded, understanding the pride that often kept people from asking for help. He knew it wasn't easy to admit vulnerability, especially for someone who had dedicated their life to serving others. Still, He couldn't help but feel the need to do something. The idea that one of his most trusted guards was suffering in silence was unacceptable to him. "I never want anyone who works for the royal family to feel like they are alone," King Charles said firmly, his eyes meeting the guards. "No one should have to go through such hardships, especially not someone who has given so much to this country. We will find a way to make this right." The guard was silent, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't easy to accept help, especially from someone as important as the king. He wasn't sure if he even deserved the kindness that was being offered to him. But at the same time, there was a flicker of hope inside him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he began to believe that things might change. King Charles placed a hand on the guard's shoulder, giving him a reassuring squeeze. "You will not face this alone any longer," the king promised. "I'll make sure you have the support you need, and together we'll work to make sure this never happens to anyone else who serves in this palace." The guard was stunned. He didn't know what to say. For a moment, he was speechless, overcome with emotion. The weight of his struggles had been so heavy for so long, but now, in the presence of the king's compassion, it felt like a burden had been lifted, just a little bit. The next morning, as the royal guard arrived for his shift, he was still processing everything that had happened the day before. King Charles's words had stayed with him, echoing in his mind. "You will not face this alone any longer." He had never imagined that the king would take such a personal interest in his well-being. The thought that someone of such importance cared about his struggles felt surreal, almost too good to be true. As he approached his post, he noticed a quiet hustle around the palace grounds. It seemed like something unusual was happening. Normally, the morning routine was calm and predictable, but today there was a palpable sense of urgency in the air. The guard felt a flicker of curiosity, but pushed it aside, focusing on his duties. However, as the minutes passed, the unease in his chest began to grow. Something was different. He was standing by the palace gates when one of the palace aides approached him, his steps quick and purposeful. The aide's expression was unreadable, but the guard noticed a slight shift in his demeanor when he saw the guard standing there. The aide paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the guard from head to toe. "Come with me," the aide said gently, motioning for the guard to follow. The guard's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what was going on, but he instinctively knew that this wasn't part of his usual routine. He followed the aide, trying to keep his composure, but his mind raced with questions. What could this be about? They walked through the palace corridors, past rooms he had never been in, until they reached a small private office. The aide opened the door, gesturing for the guard to step inside. The guard entered cautiously, his eyes scanning the room. And there, sitting behind a desk, was none other than King Charles. The king looked up as the guard entered, his face warm but serious. "Please, have a seat," he said, motioning to a chair across from him. The guard stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what was happening. But with a gentle nod from the king, he finally took a seat, his heart pounding. "Your Majesty," the guard said, his voice trembling slightly, "I didn't expect to be called here." King Charles smiled kindly, his gaze never leaving the guard. "There's no need to be nervous. I wanted to speak with you personally about something important." He paused for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "You are a valued member of this household, and I've come to realize that we as a family may not have done enough to support you. And for that, I apologize." The guard was taken aback. The king was apologizing to him. For the first time, the guard found himself truly speechless. He had never imagined that the king would take such an interest in his life beyond his duties as a guard. "Yesterday, you shared something with me that was deeply moving," King Charles continued. "And after thinking it through, I've decided that it's time we offer you the help you need, not just as your king, but as a person who cares about your well-being." The guard's mind was spinning. He had barely come to terms with the fact that the king had even noticed his struggles, let alone offered any kind of assistance. But before he could speak, King Charles raised his hand gently to stop him. "We've already taken steps to ensure that you have a place to stay, a roof over your head, and the support you deserve," the king said. "You won't need to worry about your housing anymore, and we've arranged for you to receive some financial assistance as well." The guard's mouth went dry. He wasn't sure how to process the king's words. It all felt like a dream, an overwhelming and surreal dream where his life was suddenly being turned around. For so long, he had lived without hope, without any sense that his situation could change. But now, in front of him, was a promise that his struggles would no longer go unnoticed. I can't thank you enough, Your Majesty," the guard finally managed to say, his voice choked with emotion. "I never thought anything like this would happen. I didn't even think anyone would care." King Charles smiled softly, his eyes warm with understanding. "You don't have to thank me. I want to make sure you know that we see you, we appreciate you, and we're here to help." The guard felt a lump form in his throat, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to let go of the weight he had been carrying for so long. He felt a sense of relief wash over him, as if the darkness he had been living in was beginning to lift. The king had given him not only hope, but also the courage to believe that he deserved better. "I'll make sure you get everything you need," King Charles said, standing up and offering his hand to the guard. "And remember, you're not alone. We're a family here." As the guard shook the king's hand, he realized that this moment would change. The next morning, when the royal guard arrived at his usual post, he was met with something entirely unexpected. As he walked toward the gates of Buckingham Palace, a palisade approached him, a knowing smile on his face. The guard's heart skipped a beat as he wondered what was going on now. He had already been through so much over the past few days, and he couldn't imagine what else could possibly change in his life. "Come with me," the aide said warmly without offering an explanation. The guard nodded silently, not wanting to ask too many questions. Whatever it was, he trusted that it was part of the plan the king had mentioned. The aide led him through the familiar halls of the palace, but this time they didn't stop at the usual guard posts. Instead, they continued deeper into the palace, walking through corridors the guard had never entered before. His curiosity piqued. The guard followed without speaking, his thoughts swirling with anticipation. The palace, majestic and grand as always, felt even more overwhelming now. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the aide stopped in front of a door that the guard had never seen. The wooden door was beautifully carved, with intricate designs that seemed to tell a story. With a quick knock, the aide opened the door and stepped aside. "After you," the aide said, gesturing for the guard to enter. The guard stepped inside, and his eyes went wide with shock. The room was nothing like he had ever expected. It was large and beautifully furnished, with thick curtains hanging over tall windows and a comfortable bed that looked as though it belonged in a luxury hotel. There was a small sitting area by the window, with a sofa and a few chairs, creating a warm, inviting space. Everything about the room screamed comfort and luxury, things he had never experienced before. He stood frozen in the doorway, unable to believe his eyes. The last thing he expected was for the king to provide him with such a place to stay. The royal guard had been living on the streets just days ago, unsure of where his next meal would come from. Now, here he was, standing in a beautiful room that had been prepared just for him. Before he could say anything, the aide spoke. "This is your new room, just as the king promised. From now on, you will have a place to call home." The guard was speechless. The words didn't seem real. How could it be that just a few days ago, he had been barely scraping by, and now he was standing in a room fit for royalty? His emotions began to overwhelm him, and he found himself at a loss for words. "Thank you," the guard said, his voice barely above a whisper. He had no idea how to properly express the gratitude he felt. He had never imagined that his life would change so dramatically in such a short amount of time. The aide smiled kindly. "The king wants to make sure that you are comfortable. If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask." With that, the aide turned and left, leaving the guard standing in the middle of the room, still processing everything. The royal guard looked around, taking in the details of the room. Everything was so much better than he could have ever imagined. He could hardly believe that this was real. It wasn't just a room. It was a chance at a new beginning. A place to sleep, to rest, to finally have some peace. As he sat down on the bed, the weight of the past few days started to sink in. He had never expected his life to take such a turn. For so long, he had carried his burdens alone, thinking no one would ever care. But now, King Charles had shown him that he mattered, that his struggles were not invisible. The guard's heart swelled with emotion. He was no longer alone. He had a place where he could rest, a place to call his own. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like he could finally breathe. His new life was beginning, and he was ready to face whatever came next. In that moment, as he sat there in the comfort of his new room, he realized just how much the kindness of one person could change everything. The guard knew his life would never be the same again. He had been given a second chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. The next few days were a blur for the royal guard. Each morning, he woke up in the comfort of his new room, a space he never thought he'd have the chance to call his own. The change was so sudden, so unexpected, that it almost felt like a dream. Yet every time he looked around at the luxurious surroundings, the soft bed, the warm fireplace, he knew it was real. It was a second chance at life. Chance he never imagined he would get. King Charles had kept his promise. The royal guard no longer had to worry about where he would sleep or how he would survive the next day. His life had been turned upside down in the most incredible way, and he found himself struggling to adjust to the kindness and care he was receiving. One afternoon, as he sat in the sitting area by the window, sipping a cup of tea, there was a soft knock at the door. The guard stood up quickly, unsure of who it could be. His mind raced as he walked to the door, wondering if he was in trouble or if something had gone wrong. But when he opened the door, he was surprised to see none other than King Charles himself standing in the doorway, a warm smile on his face. "Good afternoon," the king said kindly, stepping into the room. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're settling in." The guard was taken aback. It wasn't every day that the king himself came to visit, especially not with such a personal and thoughtful gesture. "Your Majesty, I didn't expect." The guard began, but the king raised a hand to stop him. "There's no need to thank me. I want to make sure you feel comfortable here," King Charles said, his voice gentle. "You're part of the royal family now, in a way. We look after our own." The guard was speechless, once again overcome with emotion. He had never imagined a monarch, let alone the king himself, would treat him with such kindness and respect. I'm so grateful, Your Majesty. I don't know what to say." King Charles smiled, clearly understanding the guard's emotions. "You don't need to say anything. I just wanted to let you know that I'm here for you. If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to ask. And if you ever feel like talking, I'm always available." The guard nodded, his throat tightening. The simple act of the king checking in on him, making sure he was okay, meant more than he could express. It was more than just the room or the food. It was the acknowledgement that he mattered, that he was seen. "I've also arranged for you to receive some additional support," King Charles continued. "We've spoken with the right people, and there are resources in place to help you get back on your feet. You'll have everything you need." The guard could hardly believe what he was hearing. Not only had the king given him a place to stay, but now there were real efforts being made to help him build a future. It was all so overwhelming that for a moment he felt like he might burst into tears. But he held it together, doing his best to mask the depth of his gratitude. "Thank you, Your Majesty. Truly, I don't deserve this," the guard said, his voice barely above a whisper. He had spent so many months in silence, hiding his struggles from the world. Now, here he was, being treated with more kindness than he could ever remember receiving. King Charles placed a hand on the guard's shoulder, his gaze warm and reassuring. "You do deserve it," he said firmly. "Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Don't ever forget that." The guard looked up, meeting the king's eyes. In that moment, he felt a connection, a bond that went beyond the royal family and the position of a soldier. It was a bond of humanity, of understanding, of compassion. As the king turned to leave, he paused at the door. "I'll be checking in on you from time to time. But remember, you're never alone. If you need anything, I'm here." The guard nodded, his heart full of gratitude. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I won't forget this." As the door closed behind the king, the guard stood still for a moment, processing everything that had happened. His life had been completely transformed, and it was all thanks to the kindness of a man who could have easily ignored his struggles. Instead, King Charles had chosen to make a difference, to offer support when it was needed most. For the first time in a long time, the guard felt truly hopeful. His future no longer seemed uncertain or full of struggle. There was a new sense of purpose in his heart, and he knew that, with the king's help, he could rebuild his life, one step at a time. As the days turned into weeks, the royal guard settled into his new life. The luxurious room became his sanctuary, a place where he could finally rest and relax without worrying about where he would sleep or how he would get by. Every morning, he awoke to the soft sounds of birds outside the window, a stark contrast to the harshness of his previous life. The warm sunlight streaming through the curtains felt like a gift, and he couldn't help but marvel at the simple comforts that he had once taken for granted. Despite the comfort, however, the guard still found it hard to adjust to his new reality. He had spent so many years surviving on his own, depending only on himself, that it was difficult for him to fully accept the kindness being offered. The royal family had treated him with more generosity and care than he had ever experienced, and had often left him feeling humbled and a little overwhelmed. He wasn't used to people looking out for him, to the idea that someone cared about his well-being beyond his duties as a guard. But as time passed, the guard began to open up. He started attending counseling sessions that had been arranged for him, speaking to professionals who could help him process his feelings and move forward. It wasn't easy, but he found that little by little, the weight he had been carrying for so long began to lift. He learned to accept the help that was offered, understanding that it wasn't a sign of weakness, but of strength, a strength he had never fully recognized in himself before. One day, while walking through the palace grounds, the guard ran into King Charles again. The king had been making his rounds, as he often did, checking in on various parts of the palace and its staff. He noticed the guard from a distance, his familiar face now looking a little more at ease, his posture straighter than before. There was no longer the same weariness in his eyes, no longer the same sadness that had once clouded his gaze. The king walked over with a smile, and the guard snapped to attention. "How are you doing?" King Charles asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. "I'm doing well, Your Majesty," the guard replied, his words coming more easily now. "Thank you for everything." The king nodded, his eyes scanning the guard's face. "I can see that," he said warmly. "You seem like a different man." The guard smiled, feeling a sense of pride in his words. "I'm starting to feel like one." King Charles placed a hand on the guard's shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie and understanding. "I'm glad to hear that. I knew you had it in you. You've always been strong. You just needed a little support to see it." The guard felt a lump form in his throat, but he pushed it aside. He had come a long way from the man who had stood outside the palace gates, struggling to keep his life together. And though there was still much more work to be done, he felt more confident about his future than he ever had before. "It's been a long road," the guard said softly, "but I'm grateful for everything. The room, the help, the chance to start over." The king's eyes twinkled with a mixture of pride and compassion. "You've earned it. And remember, this is just the beginning. You'll go far from here, I have no doubt." The guard stood a little taller, the weight of the king's words settling in his chest. For the first time, he felt like he had a future, one where he wasn't just surviving but truly living. He had been given the tools to rebuild his life. And with time, he was confident he could build something strong and lasting. As the king walked away, the guard stood still for a moment, watching him disappear into the distance. It was then that he realized just how much his life had changed in such a short amount of time. He had gone from living on the streets to receiving support from the highest levels of the royal family. He had gone from feeling invisible to feeling seen and valued. The royal guard was no longer just a soldier standing at attention. He was a man with hope, with a new sense of purpose, and with the understanding that no one, no matter their struggles, was ever truly alone. It wasn't just the palace that had changed his life. It was the people in it, particularly one compassionate king who had shown him that kindness could create a ripple effect, one that would echo through his life for years to come. As the months went by, the royal guard's life continued to transform in ways he never imagined possible. The routine he had once known, filled with the monotony of his military duties, was now filled with hope and purpose. Every day, he woke up in his comfortable room, a space that felt more like home with each passing day. The warmth of the fire in the hearth, the soft linens of the bed, and the quiet of the palace around him were constant reminders of how much had changed since that fateful day when King Charles had noticed him and taken an interest in his well-being. The guard continued his duties with the same dedication as before, but now there was a renewed sense of energy in him. He no longer simply went through the motions. He had something to work for, something to look forward to. The counseling and support had helped him gain a fresh perspective, teaching him to appreciate the small victories in life and to understand that asking for help didn't diminish his strength, but rather reinforced it. One afternoon, as he stood guard outside Buckingham Palace, he saw the familiar figure of King Charles approaching again. The king had been making more frequent visits, checking in on his staff, and ensuring that everyone was well. The guard had come to appreciate these visits, not only because they reminded him of the kindness the king had shown, but also because they marked the progress he had made in his journey. The king smiled as he approached, his expression warm and sincere. "How are you today?" he asked, his voice carrying the same genuine care it always did. "I'm doing well, Your Majesty," the guard replied, standing a little taller than he used to. His confidence had grown, and it was clear from his voice that he no longer carried the weight of the past on his shoulders. "I'm glad to hear that," King Charles said, studying the guard for a moment. "You've come a long way since I first spoke with you. I can see it in your eyes." The guard looked up, meeting the king's gaze with a newfound sense of strength. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I don't think I could have done it without your help." The king chuckled softly. "I may have given you a little push, but you've done the hard work yourself. I always knew you had it in you." The guard smiled, feeling a sense of pride swell in his chest. He had earned the king's praise, and it was a feeling he had never imagined would be within his reach. When he had first joined the royal guard, his sole focus had been on protecting the royal family. But now he realized his journey had become about much more than that. It had become about discovering his own strength, his own worth. As the king continued to speak with him, the guard couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. He remembered the days when he had felt invisible, when he had believed no one would care about his struggles. Now he was standing tall, a respected member of the royal household, someone who had been given a second chance to rebuild his life. "I've been meaning to tell you something," the king said, his voice more serious now. "The work you've done here, your dedication, and your resilience have not gone unnoticed. You've proven yourself time and again, and I believe you deserve more than just a second chance. You've earned a future full of opportunity." The guard's heart raced. The king's words were not just kind, they were a promise that his life would continue to improve, that his struggles would not define him but shape him into someone capable of greatness. He had thought that his past, with all its hardships, would always be a part of him, holding him back. But now he realized it had made him stronger, more determined than ever. "Thank you, Your Majesty," the guard said, his voice steady despite the rush of emotions flooding through him. "I won't let you down." King Charles smiled once more. "I know you won't. And remember, you're not alone in this. We're all part of this family now. And that means we'll be here to support you every step of the way." The guard nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. For the first time in years, he felt like he truly belonged, like his future wasn't uncertain, but full of possibility. He had gone from a man with no home, no hope, to someone who had been given the chance to rebuild his life, not just through material support, but through the belief of those around him. As the king turned to leave, the guard watched him walk away with a heart full of hope. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, but he also knew he was no longer walking it alone. The kindness of one man had changed everything, and for that, the guard would be forever grateful. The future, once a blur of uncertainty, now seemed bright, full of promise, and filled with the knowledge that kindness had the power to change lives.